Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, after all these years, hope you got it. It's jnf.org. And in just a short while, I'll be sharing with you info and dates for the upcoming Jewish National Fund USA Conference 2023. So get your calendars out for that. But first, to mark the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War this October 2023, we are welcoming back Matti Friedman to the program. Our guest on episode 73, an awfully long time ago, Matti is an award-winning journalist and author. Born in Toronto and based in Jerusalem, his work has appeared regularly in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, and so many other outlets. His fourth book is Who by Fire? Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. It tells the story of the singer performing for Israeli troops during the Yom Kippur War. It's published by Spiegel, Grau, and you can pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. And with that, Matti joins us now on the line via Zoom from his Jerusalem home. Welcome back to the program, Matti. So fantastic to see you.
It's great to be here.
All right, listen, I really have to congratulate you on the book. I read it cover to cover in just several seatings. And what I loved about it is that it's not only about the Yom Kippur War, it's about Leonard Cohen. It's about the notion of performing during war. It's individual stories. It's really all rolled into one. And it's just a remarkable work. And I truly hope that folks within earshot really will pick up a copy. And for those that are watching us via YouTube right now, you can see me holding up a copy of the book. So again, congratulations on it. And really, if you can take us back to the very beginning, how did the idea for the book even get started? Because it seems like such a esoteric subject.
The idea came to me in 2009, which is when Cohen showed up in Israel for what turned out to be his last concert here. And at that time, Cohen was an elderly guy. He was in his mid-70s, and he was enjoying this incredible resurrection. He had, of course, been a huge star in the 60s and 70s, and he'd been part of that village scene with Dylan and Joan Baez and Judy Collins and Nico and people like that. And then he'd, come in and out of the public consciousness, and he disappeared in the 90s into a Zen Buddhist monastery, came back out and was sent back out on the road to tour, in part because it turned out that a former manager of his had stolen all of his money. So he embarked on a world tour, and it wasn't clear if anyone really wanted to see Leonard Cohen or if he still had what it took. And it turned out that there were hundreds of thousands of people who were dying to see Leonard Cohen. He was filling the stadiums across the world. And the final concert in that first Resurrection tour that he did was in Israel. It was in Tel Aviv, and he showed up in Israel, and I was really shocked to see how big a deal he was for Israelis. I'm Canadian, so I understood Cohen as kind of a Canadian hero, and it turned out that Israelis kind of went crazy when Leonard Cohen came here, and 50,000 people came out to see him, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on or what explained the depth of the connection. And then I read an article in Yediot Achronot, which is an Israeli daily paper, and it was an article about this tour that had happened during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and I'd never heard of this before. But it turned out that at the darkest moment of the war, which is perhaps the darkest moment in Israel's history post-independence, the army is in disarray in Sinai, and everything's going terrible. And out of the dust of battle in Sinai comes Leonard Cohen on some, strange Jewish quest. And he gives one of the craziest and strangest concert tours of rock history. And it really surprised me that no one had written anything about that seemed to be worth unpacking. And I started taking notes on it, and I wanted to write a book about it. At that time, I had never written a book, so I didn't know how one would go about doing that. And I had to write 3 other books and then come back to this idea. And eventually I did. So it took quite a while, right, from 2009 until last year, 2022, when the book finally came out.
Well, first of all, congratulations once again on the book. And you've written 4 books. All of them are award-winning books. Would you say that you're most proud then of this book just because of the topic and sort of the challenge in writing the book? Because we're going to get into the challenges in just a sec.
It's like I have 4 kids as well. So if you ask me, am I most proud of the most recent kid? It depends, I guess, if he was asking or someone else. Um, I guess I'm proud of the fact that I managed to piece together this story over a very long period of time. It's quite a short book. I think it's 220 pages or something like
100,
that.
186.
Okay, there you go. Maybe 220 with the notes. Goes to show you how close I'm paying attention
Yes.
to the length of what I'm writing. But it's quite a short book, and yet it took a really long time to write because the research was really challenging. I had to track down the soldiers who'd seen Cohen and Sinai. The entire history of this tour had never been written, so even the army wasn't documenting it in real time. So the tour existed in these scraps of memory in the minds of soldiers and photographs and private photo albums. Cohen seemed never to have mentioned it when I started my research, and I had to kind of figure out how I was supposed to work around that. So it took quite a while to put it together. So I guess I am proud of the fact that an idea that came to me in 2009, was not abandoned and ultimately came to fruition 13 years later or whatever it was.
Yes, Matti, because there were such disparate resources that you used in terms of compiling this book. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you got access to Cohen's diaries and Cohen's work throughout the process, and how did you track down these individuals that saw him or were tangentially related to him?
It started out just by using the Israeli kind of human network. I would, someone would tell me that this guy named Moshe saw Cohen in Sinai, and I would call him up, and he'd say, "No, it wasn't me, but you should call my friend Reuven." I'd call Reuven, and he'd say, "Yes, I saw him, and you should also, call my friend, Huti. Here's her phone number." So I was just passed along, in these very tight Israeli social networks of people who'd been in the war, and I found photographs of people who I managed to identify, and I managed to track them down. There was a photograph of someone from the Navy, so I understood that Cohen had done a show on a Navy boat in the Gulf of Suez. And I figured out who those people were, and that all took quite a while. The black hole for me was Cohen himself, because it was going to be very hard to write a book without knowing what Cohen thought about any of this. And the silence that surrounded this story in Cohen's biography was very strange. I mean, if we understand how deep he went into the war and how deep the impression was that he left on the soldiers who saw him, then it's quite strange that he almost never mentioned it. And the biographies of Cohen, there's a really good one called "I'm Your Man" by Sylvie Simmons. It mentions the war tour, but doesn't make a big deal of it. So I didn't have a lot to work with, certainly not enough to make a book possible. And the solution for me at the outset, I hoped, would be to interview Leonard Cohen, who was alive and kicking when I first had the idea for the book. And I didn't know how I was supposed to get to Leonard Cohen. It seemed pretty hard. But then I realized, after publishing my second book, which is called Pumpkin Flowers, it's a military memoir, I realized that my Canadian publisher, McClellan and Stewart, is also Cohen's publisher. From the beginning of his career, McClellan and Stewart published Cohen, and I just thought, amazing, I can try to get them through the publisher. And I asked my editor, a guy who I love named Doug Pepper in Toronto, I said, "Can you get me to Cohen? I have this idea for a book about his concert tour in the Yom Kippur War. Can you hook me up with him?" And he said, "I don't see why not." He said, "Just send me a synopsis of the book idea, and we'll get it to Cohen's people, and we'll see if we can make it happen." And I said, "Amazing." So I sat down. This is the fall of 2016. I sat down, wrote a little summary of what I planned to write in this book, and I attached this famous photograph of Cohen standing next to General Ariel Sharon in Sinai, which is a pretty wild photograph, and I thought it would jog Cohen's memory. And I put it in a Word document, sent it off to my editor, went to sleep, woke up the next morning with an email from him in my inbox, and the subject line of the email was, pardon my French, it was "holy," and it was just a link to Cohen's obituary. So he had died, more or less, when I hit send on that email. And I was pretty, distraught about it, because I thought that was my only shot at writing the book. And of course, I was sad that Leonard Cohen had died. And I, of course, always hoped to see him in concert, and that was clearly not going to happen. And so I kind of moped about for a couple of months. And then miraculously discovered that there was an unpublished Cohen manuscript about the war lying in a box in the McMaster University Library in Hamilton, Ontario, outside Toronto. And thanks to a very intrepid librarian who I always like to thank by name, because without him, I wouldn't have much of a book, Chris Long, at the McMaster University Library. Because of Chris kind of went into the stacks and found this manuscript. And the manuscript was 45 pages of unedited, unfiltered Cohen. He returned from the war, sat down in front of his typewriter and cranked out this very strange, but also very authentic account of what had just happened. And you've read the books, you know that segments of that manuscript are also in the book, and they allow us to hear about these events from the man himself.
Just brilliant. And again, I love the interviews and the personal stories that you brought into the book, because I know I'm like skipping way ahead on something. But for example, you brought in the beautiful story about the couple that got married on the Bathsheba ship, right? Or about Isaac, the photographer that traveled with everybody, and so many other stories, some that survived and some that didn't. And you paint a picture of war that is just absolute hell, and of these kids, because they're really kids. And as we speak today, they're grandparents. And so there's that you bridge throughout the whole book. It's just so beautifully written. But I am going to take another really big step back, if you don't mind, just really briefly, and talk about the Israel of 1973, but in the context of the halo of the 1967 war, because you point that out in the book, that in many ways, Israel became complacent after the 67 war. I don't know if that was your word, but it's my word that I'm using. And just for the sake of our listeners that might not be so familiar with Israel or Israeli history, Matti, because we have a very global audience and people are coming to the Israel story at varying understandings of the country, can you paint the picture of the period, what happened in 67, and paint the picture of 67 to 73?
So in 1967, there's this great military victory. In 6 days, Israel defeats 3 Arab armies and conquers Sinai and conquers the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and the old city of Jerusalem. And it's considered this great military victory. It turned out afterward to be much more complicated than people thought. But at the time, there was this euphoria about the victory, and many people thought that Israel had no longer had anything to worry about militarily, and they thought that perhaps Israel's problems had been solved by the victory and the.
And if I can interrupt you, though, but it was provoked by Israel's neighbors. It's not that Israel started the war, provoked the war.
The main actor in the lead up to the war is Nasser, who's the dictator of Egypt, and he needs a war for his own reasons, or is playing some kind of very risky game of brinksmanship, which gets out of control, and it really kind of goes disastrously wrong for him and for the Syrians, and ultimately for the Jordanians, who get into the war even though Israel's asked them to stay out, and the Jordanians make a terrible error of judgment and they attack across the line in Jerusalem and end up losing Jerusalem and the West Bank. And the Israel that we have today is in many ways kind of a result of that war. But this leads to a few years of euphoria where the country really lets its guard down, and it gets very confused about the actual state of affairs. So this leads to a situation in the fall of 1973 when the army is just unprepared for what happens on Yom Kippur 1973, October 6th, which is a surprise attack on 2 fronts by the Egyptians and the Syrians, who are still smarting from this defeat in 1967 and who need to restore their lost honor and maybe restore some of the land they lost. And the military intelligence people here completely miss it, and the army is just not ready for it, and the border defenses are overrun in the first hours of the war, and ultimately Israel loses 2,600 soldiers in 3 weeks. And this is a country of barely 3 million people at the time. So the Yom Kippur War is a major catastrophe on its own, but it's also it also needs to be understood, as you're saying, in kind of juxtaposition with that great victory 6 years earlier. So a great victory followed by, and it's not exactly a defeat. Israel wins the Yom Kippur War, but it's a victory that feels like a defeat, and it changes the country. And in many ways, Israel post 73 is a completely different place.
And we'll talk about that in a second, but let's talk about the global response, though, because you write here in the book, after the Six-Day War, when the West was briefly in love with Israelis for its own complex and guilty reasons. And I'm wondering if you can address that, because during the 73 war, the West basically abandoned Israel.
Right. So, I mean, the 67 war happens in Europe and in North America. That's very much post-Holocaust. So people have these very fresh memories of what had happened. And the Jewish population of Europe had largely been annihilated with minimal intervention from anyone else. And there was a lot of guilt about that. There'd been a lot of collaboration in Europe. It wasn't just the Nazis. And people saw Israel as a kind of correction to that. So they were very eager to see Israel succeed, in part because it seemed to offset the disaster of the 1940s. So yes, it's true the Holocaust happened, but look at these people, they have a great country. They're dancing around in the fields of the kibbutz and, and whatnot. And look, they just won this incredible military victory against great odds. And Israelis were very popular for a while. And that sentence in the book appears when I'm discussing another music tour where Israeli musicians tour Europe and America and are greeted, with a lot of enthusiasm because Israel was very popular for a couple of years. And then in 73, things change. I mean, the initiative for the war comes from the Arab side, but now the Arab world is using oil in a way that's more sophisticated, and they're imposing an oil boycott. And the considerations for many countries, particularly in Europe, get more complicated, and they basically abandon Israel. I mean, they won't let resupply flights land en route from the United States to Israel, and Israelis end up feeling quite isolated in the war.
So then we come to 73, and really in 73, tell us what happened.
So on October 6, 1973, at 2 p.m., this is Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur in Israel is a fast day, of course, and people are...
Well, across the Jewish world it is. It's our Day of Atonement, yeah.
Absolutely. And in Israel, you really feel that there are no flights in and out of the airport. There are no radio broadcasts. There's no TV. The streets are empty. You can bike down the middle of the highway. So you really feel it. And many Israelis are in synagogue, and they're not really thinking about the possibility of a war. And at 2 p.m. on October 6th, there's the surprise attack. The Egyptians attack across the Suez Canal, and the Syrians on the Golan Heights, and sirens go off across the country, and people think it might be a drill, but it becomes clear very quickly that it's not a drill. And thousands of men are called up, and they rush off to the front, and what ensues is a 3-week war that is devastating. I mean, it's devastating for the attackers as well, but it's certainly devastating for Israel, which, at least in the first week, cannot handle the attacks and is falling back. And it looks quite possible in that first week that Israel is actually going to lose this war. The Arab armies have obtained new anti-aircraft rockets called SAMs. They've been given them by the Soviets, and the Soviets are supporting the Arab side, and the Americans are beginning to support the Israeli side more enthusiastically, which, by the way, was not true before 1967. So the Arab armies have these anti-aircraft systems which are paralyzing the Israeli Air Force, and that allows the Arab infantry forces to advance, and it prevents the kind of knockout victory that Israel had in 67 when the Air Force basically decides the war within a few hours of the war's outbreak. So things look very different in that first week of the Yom Kippur War, at which point Leonard Cohen, for complicated reasons, decides to insert himself into these events.
Okay, and that's where the story now begins. So at that point, Leonard Cohen is living on the Greek island of Hydra with his partner. He's not yet married to her, and their son. So take us through his rationale. He's such a complex individual, Matti. I feel like we can have a whole episode just on what has gone on or what went on in his brain throughout his life. But talk us through his rationale for going to Israel in the first place.
And he's such a cagey character, Cohen, that he never comes out and tells us exactly what he was doing. We have to kind of figure it out from conversations that he had with people in Israel and from this manuscript that he wrote, which is amazing. It's an amazing resource, but it's not journalistic. So I would like him just to spell out why he came, what he did, and on which dates. But he's a poet. He's just not into that kind of writing. So we have to do a lot of guessing. But we can say two things, I think, with some level of certainty. Israel's crisis is a way out of his own personal and artistic crisis, which is very strong. At the time, Leonard Cohen had announced that year in 1973 that he was retiring. He said publicly that he'd had enough of the music business, that he just wanted to shut up, that he'd kind of lost faith in his art. And this was a star who'd had major hits like Suzanne and So Long Marianne and Sisters of Mercy. I mean, he had really big songs. He played the biggest venues. He played the Isle of Wight Festival, which was a year after Woodstock, and it was much bigger than Woodstock. So we're talking about a major figure, but he kind of he'd hit a wall creatively. He was also in a personal crisis. He wasn't married to Suzanne, but they had a long relationship, and they had a child at that time. They would ultimately have two. And he calls her his wife in his own writing, although technically they were never married. And they're living together on this Greek island called Hydra. And they have a 1-year-old son, Cohen's first child, and he's 39 years old, which is prime territory for a midlife crisis. And it really hits pretty hard. He'd been kind of pursued by depression before that, but he's at a particularly dark point in his life. And he's stranded on this island with this woman with whom he's very unhappy in some ways. And he's kind of in this family situation, right? He's a father. He can't just leave. He can't run away. And then suddenly this war breaks out, and he feels, alongside this crisis and this need to get out, and this idea that Israel's crisis offers a way out of his own crisis because he can run away to the war. He also has this deep identification with Israel and with the Jewish people, which is very much part of who Leonard Cohen is. Leonard Cohen is the son of a very important Jewish family from Montreal. He grows up in this kind of, I guess, elite institution in Canada called Shara Shamayim, which is a synagogue in Montreal, which is to this day, a really important Jewish institution in Montreal. Cohen's grandfather had been the president of the synagogue. Cohen's great-grandfather had been the president of the synagogue. On his mother's side, Cohen was the grandson of an important a religious scholar, a rabbi named Shlomo Klemetsky Klein, who came from Kovno in Lithuania. So he's from a very serious Jewish family, a very deeply involved Jewish family, and he has
what we call yichus.
He's got yichus. He's coming from the
lineage.
Absolutely, he comes from the top of Montreal Jewish society, and he's deeply connected with this with Judaism. Although he made the decision to leave his community years before, and there's a great speech that he gives. You can actually find this on YouTube. In 1964, the community invites him to speak to the community at a symposium at the Montreal Jewish Public Library, which is another important Montreal institution. And they want to hear what he has to say, and he's just starting to get famous as a poet in Canada. And he comes and he tells them what he wants to say, and they don't really like what he says. He explains what's wrong with Judaism in our times. And he says, once we, the Jews, had a genius for the vertical, by which he means we knew how to look up and receive divine messages. We knew how to look up toward God and hear what God was telling us and transmit this in the language of humans. Once he said we all stood together 3,000 years ago and experienced a vertical seizure. That's what he says. And he means Mount Sinai. He means the Jews are standing at Mount Sinai and they're receiving a message from God together. And he calls it a vertical seizure, which is a beautiful Leonard Cohen phrase. And he says, now we're all horizontalists. We're knocking on our own doors and we're surprised that no one answers. What he means is that we're busy thinking about what we're wearing, what we're driving to synagogue, an empty ritual, and we've completely missed the point of Judaism. We've completely lost the heart of it. And he says we have to cancel all religious services here until someone reports a vision or breaks his mind on the infinite, and he leaves. And that's basically how he checks out of the community that raised him. And he goes, very far from Montreal. He ends up in the village, and he ends up in London, and he goes to Hydra, this Greek island, but he's always deeply connected to it. He can never get away from it, even if he tried. And when this war happens, he understands that Israel is the center of the Jewish world. He calls it his myth home, and he just has to be there. He has to be there. He can't stand on the sidelines when something like this is going on. So he gets on an airplane and flies right in.
It was almost like a calling for him, really.
I think so.
Yeah. And at one point towards the beginning of the book and the narrative about why he went, I believe he said to somebody that he wanted to work on a kibbutz so he can free up labor so that they can go and fight. In other words, that was going to be his reason for being there. Yet he had a chance meeting with some singers who he attached himself to, and then subsequently they went all over the place. And so it was very much under the radar, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Cohen comes by himself. There's no entourage. There are no groupies. He's announced that he's retired from music. So it seems pretty clear that he's not coming as a musician. He's not coming to play.
And he didn't bring his guitar.
He did not bring his guitar, which really is an indication that he's not coming to play. He's doing something else. I don't think he really knows what he's going to do. I think he wants to be here. And he kind of bums around the country for a few days, and he describes it in his manuscript. And I actually managed to find people who are mentioned in the manuscript, and they confirm that this is more or less what happened. He meets some people, and he goes here and he goes there. He tells people he wants to pick grapefruit, and which seems kind of like a waste of Leonard Cohen's unique abilities. But I think he did not have faith in those abilities at that
He
moment.
might have been a good grapefruit picker. You know it, Matti.
Yeah, it could have been. That could have been the career change that
he needed.
That he needed. Actually, who knows? Maybe he would have been happier. I'm not sure. He's bumming around Tel Aviv. He's sitting in a bohemian cafe called Pinati, one of the few bohemian cafes in Tel Aviv in those years. Tel Aviv in '73 is not like Tel Aviv now. It's a very small place, still kind of deeply traumatized by the fact that its population is a population of refugees, and it's a kind of a rough place, but it's starting to develop its own culture. And Cohen is sitting in this cafe, and he's recognized by a few Israeli singers who are also in the cafe. And these are very famous singers in Israel, but he has no idea who they are. It's Ilana Rovina, who's a singer and an actress, Matti Kaspi, who's a musical genius, who at the time is just 23, so he's just kind of starting out, and a singer named Oshik Levy, who's a major star. And Oshik looks across the cafe and says, I think that's Leonard Cohen in the cafe. Now, Leonard Cohen is a big international name. There's no reason for him to be in Tel Aviv in the middle of the Yom Kippur War, and the other singers are skeptical, and Oshik says, no, I'm going to prove it. And he walks over and he says, excuse me, are you Leonard Cohen? And when it turns out to be Leonard Cohen, they talk him out of his grapefruit plan, and instead talk him into coming with them. They say, we're going to play for soldiers at the front, and you have to come with us. And he's reticent at first. He says, my music is too depressing. It's just gonna, it's gonna make the soldiers sad. It's not gonna get them riled up for battle. And they say, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And they get him a guitar. They somehow manage to wrangle a guitar from the Israeli Air Force in the worst week in the history of the Israeli Air Force, where the Air Force has lost so many planes and pilots that it's being hidden from the public. But someone in the Air Force has time to find a guitar for Leonard Cohen, and they set off on what I think is one of the greatest rock tours of all time.
And he wanted to be called by his Hebrew name, Eliezer, versus Leonard. And he just slept on sleeping bags, on mattresses. He ate army rations. He just wanted to be treated just like one of the guys rather than Leonard Cohen superstar.
That's right. The other singers say that he was really modest. They tried to set him up with, better living conditions, like a bed, for example, or his own room, and not that there were any 5-star accommodations available in Sinai, but apparently he wouldn't go for it. He insisted on sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor, eating what everyone else was eating. If you see the pictures, you see, and there are a few from the tour, but there's no film, unfortunately, but there are photographs. You see he's wearing something that looks a lot like a uniform, and he is calling himself Eliezer, which is very interesting. Eliezer is his Hebrew name. Leonard Cohen is born with the name Eliezer ben Nisan Cohen. And Leonard is a hard name for Israelis to say. To this day, people here call him Leonard Cohen. But Eliezer Cohen is it's almost a forgettable Israeli name. It's a very standard Israeli name, like Joe Smith. And he kind of goes native. I mean, at least initially, in the first phase of the war, because this changes, but in the first phase of the war, he sees himself as part of this. And his name is Eliezer, and he's with the soldiers 100%. It does change as the war wears on and things get more complicated.
Yeah, and at one point in the book, you say that he might be the foreign artist whose songs are most translated and performed in Israel. That was then, I believe, but today as well?
No, it's today. I mean, I don't think it would have been true at the time, but today it is. I mean, new Cohen covers come out fairly frequently, and some of them are very well known here. Leonard Cohen is really, I won't say the most popular foreign artist here, But he's definitely one of them, and which is a contrast actually to the way he's seen in the United States, where he's more of a niche figure. He kind of has a cult following, but he's not. He doesn't have Dylan's cachet in America, even though I think he's as good as Dylan. But in Israel, he is as famous as Bob Dylan, and in some ways, people feel more strongly about Leonard Cohen than about Bob Dylan. So people really love Cohen, and a lot of it is the content of his music, which is incredible and very deeply Jewish. And part of it is, who he is, and part of it is the fact that he came to Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And I think that that's, even if people never really knew the details of the tour, it's something that Israelis know, that at this dark and desperate moment for Israel, when almost no one had our back, Leonard Cohen showed up. He came. He didn't have to come, and
you address that in the book. Is that people said that he wasn't weapons, he wasn't fuel, but the fact that he showed up was enough.
Yeah, it made people feel that they weren't alone. And being Israeli involves a certain feeling of isolation. I mean, we're in the Middle East. We're not, extremely popular in the region, and we don't have that many good friends. And it meant something to people that Leonard Cohen had taken the trouble to come. I mean, not only did he come to Israel, he went to the front,
right,
which he certainly did not have to do. And not only did he go to the front, he was at the tip of the fighting. He crossed the Suez Canal a day or two behind the Israeli army. The Israeli army embarks on this great counterattack, which changes the course of the war, and they cross the Suez Canal onto Egyptian territory. And within a day or two, we have photographs of Leonard Cohen there. And so he is there with them, and that meant a lot. Even if it had no, strategic meaning, and it wasn't a Hercules transport full of weapons, but it had a lot of emotional resonance for the soldiers who saw him.
Yeah, he really crisscrossed the Sinai. He was down in Sharm el-Sheikh. As you said, he crossed into the Suez. I mean, he probably covered, I would venture to say, more territory than a lot of soldiers did, because they just, went to one place. It was such a brutal, brutal war, though. And I want to go there with you now, and then we'll take just a really short break. But can you really talk about the I can't think of another word than brutality of this war. I mean, this wasn't just a bunch of drones dropping bombs on people, etc. I mean, this was a really vicious war, and there were so many lives that were lost, and so unnecessarily, really. And if you can just address that, because you bring that to life, just the horrors of war in the book as well.
Yeah, the war's a total nightmare, and I mean, all wars are.
Mm-hmm.
But the Yom Kippur War for Israelis in particular was kind of a nightmare scenario, because the country was caught off guard, and because the army was kind of sent into battle unprepared, and it took a week to stabilize the front. And in that, week is an eternity for soldiers at the front, and thousands of soldiers are killed, and many thousands more are wounded. And Sinai is full of charred tanks and like bodies lying in the sand, and yeah, it's kind of a hellscape when Leonard Cohen shows up there. It's not it's not a video game war. It's very much that old kind of terrible war with close combat and tank combat, and yeah, really awful. And Leonard Cohen was right there. He wasn't. I think some people who might know about this tour might imagine that it was kind of like a Bob Hope USO tour, or like that scene in Apocalypse Now where the Playboy bunnies land in helicopters at some rear base, where there's kind of like an amphitheater, like far from the actual fighting. And that's not all what this was. Leonard Cohen was driving around in a Jeep at the front, and they were stopping. He and his companions, they'd stop when they saw a few soldiers, and they'd say, "Do you want to hear some music?" And if they said yes, they would set up a stage out of ammo crates, and they would just play in the desert. And you can see it in the photographs. There's no chairs, there's no, and there's certainly no lights. In one photograph, I think there's an amp, but it's it's very bare bones. And Cohen, much of the time, is just kind of crouching in the sand with his guitar, so he's right there.
Just on a lighter note, I have to say, when you invoke the USO on the One Way Ticket Show podcast, which I have to give a shout out to, soon to celebrate its 12th anniversary, one of my guests in August was the legendary Hollywood icon Anne Margaret. And of course, she was known for many things, for co-starring with everyone from Betty Davis to Elvis to Jack Nicholson to you name it, but also for performing in Vietnam with the USO. She was there. She was actually, interestingly, in Europe as a freshman at Northwestern University. She went over to perform in Europe with the USO. And then there was a petition signed by 3,000 soldiers in Vietnam in 1966 to bring Anne Margaret over to perform with the USO. So she performed there. Of course, she was a sensation of a star, and so they wanted to see her. And she went over in 66, and then she went over back with Bob Hope in 68, who I believe you just invoked. So it's a very different dynamic. That's what we think of when we think of entertaining the troops, is the Anne Margarets, the Bob Hopes going over. But this was just bare bones, just him with a guitar and then singing to people. And I want to talk in just a sec about this dynamic of soldiers and music. But first, also a little bit on a lighter, but an important note, Matti, because we actually met in Washington, D.C. in September of 2018. It was before the pandemic, which seems like, 12,000 lifetimes ago, at the Jewish National Fund USA conference, the conference on Israel. And I just want to share with our dear listeners around the world that, yes, indeed, it's that time of year again where Jewish National Fund USA's global conference for Israel will be taking place. It will all be happening in Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City. We're going to be talking about Golda Meir in just a sec, but of course, we know that she spent time in Denver after having moved to the United States and after having moved to Milwaukee. So it's apropos that the conference is in Denver. I think probably no connection there, but it's all happening November 30th to December 3rd to join leaders from around the world in talking about everything exciting that's going on in Israel, innovation, technology, food, you name it, the whole beautiful Zionist experience. It's all taking place in Denver, Colorado, plus America's largest Shabbat dinner. And I don't know about you, Matti, but I love a good Shabbat dinner. It's the company, it's the people that make a Shabbat dinner, wouldn't you say?
I'm sure Shabbat dinner in Denver is a very beautiful experience.
Right. Well, anywhere it's a beautiful experience, especially when it's America's largest Shabbat dinner. I don't know about Canada's largest Shabbat dinner, but it's America's largest Shabbat dinner. And so for more and to register, do visit jnf.org/global. Once again, jnf.org/global. Yours truly will be there. I'm going to be moderating 2 panels and doing a bunch of interviews on the side. So hope to see everybody there and come on by and say hello. All right, listen, Matti, back to our conversation right now. And again, the book, Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. When I was reading the book, I'm really glad that you pointed out at several points in the work this dynamic between a performer and soldiers, because certainly there are many times where a soldier does not want to be entertained. A soldier does not want to have his or her spirits uplifted. They're not in the mood. They just don't want to hear that. And yet you have these entertainers that show up. So if you can take a step back and talk about the history of sort of entertainment in war, particularly in Israel, and this dynamic, because again, as you pointed out, some of them didn't want to hear any people singing.
Right, and it's a very different tradition than the one in the United States. Of course, American wars tend to be fought far from America, and that changes the dynamic a bit. And there are those great images of USO tours and people like Anne Margaret, who you mentioned. I'm surprised that the Viet Cong didn't just kind of wave the white flag and give up after she and Bob Hope landed. But in Israel, it's a bit.
By the way, she also went to the front lines too.
They did amazing things. I mean,
they really did, yeah.
James Brown did an amazing tour in Vietnam of the front.
You point that out in the book, yeah. Johnny Cash.
The story of the Brown tour in Vietnam is really kind of a rich story that no one's really ever done anything with. But
it's your next book, Matti.
I don't know if I'm really the one to write it, but it's definitely interesting. There's a lot of very loaded racial issues in that story. Brown goes to Vietnam. It's 1968. I mean, I think it's not long after Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and it's just all very loaded. There's racial tension in the military in Vietnam. Anyway, we're getting off topic, but an artist coming to the front is never simple. for either the artists or the soldiers, because they're two worlds colliding. The soldiers are risking their lives, and it's pretty clear that this might be one of the last things they hear. And then this kind of alien lands from outer space and plays, some pop song, and sometimes it's terrible. And I remember, and I mentioned this in the book, we finished when I was in the Army in the infantry unit in the late 90s. We finished a tour of duty, which sounds very Vietnam-esque. It wasn't as bad as Vietnam, but we came down from a tour on in the Lebanon security zone, where there was this very small scale war going on with Hezbollah, and we were rotated down and taken for a week of R&R, and they brought this pop singer to do a performance for us as part of the R&R. This poor woman who had like a kind of bubblegum pop hit, and she came in with two dancers to entertain the troops, and it was absolutely horrific. I mean, we were not into it. It seemed completely ridiculous to us, and she had to do this performance to a bunch of soldiers who were absolutely, hostile. So it doesn't always work, and yet the Cohen concerts seem to really work. And in Israel, there is a tradition that musicians travel to the front to entertain troops. Of course, the front in Israel is very close, so in some cases, it's just a matter of getting into a car and driving, an hour to the front to play for soldiers. So it's all much closer. The wars have traditionally been more existential, and there's always been a sense in Israel that we're all in it together, and the musicians set off. But it doesn't always work. The Cohen concerts seem to have worked, and that is very interesting, because Cohen could have been seen as someone who was exploiting the war for PR. He could have been seen as a war tourist. The soldiers might have said, "What does this guy want from us? He's from America, from the village, from Canada, what's he doing here?" And yet it worked. And there's this very powerful connection that's formed between Cohen and the soldiers. And a lot of it is this authenticity that Cohen projected. It was very clear that he was not exploiting this for his own ends. And there were no film crews, and there was no PR, and no one was paying for tickets, and no one was selling records. And this guy was clearly with the soldiers 100%. And Cohen had this ability, which you could see in some of the concert footage from that time. He has this ability to project empathy and really connect with audiences. And it happened at the Isle of Wight Festival, which there's a documentary film about that festival, which is quite amazing, because the crowd at the Isle of Wight Festival is insane. The weather's terrible. They're angry, I think, about ticket prices or something. There's half.
Yeah, they were unruly, weren't they?
They were throwing bottles at Jimi Hendrix, and they burned the stage, I think, with Chris Christopherson on the stage. I might be getting the date wrong, but it was a wild scene. And then Cohen comes out on stage at like 2:00 in the morning, and he just calms everyone down. He hypnotizes the crowd. And you can see it on film. It's quite something. He'd been giving concerts in mental hospitals in the early 70s. And there, too, the accounts are of these very powerful concerts where there's a real connection formed between the performer and the audience, which is a very unique audience. And Cohen manages to do it with the soldiers as well. They feel that he's authentic. They feel that he understands them in some way. And that manages to bridge this cultural gap that exists between them and Cohen, who, of course, is singing in English, which is a language that many of the soldiers don't speak, and Cohen did not speak modern Hebrew. So there's a gap that you think would have torpedoed the concerts, but in fact, they're part of this crazy energy that everyone who was at one of these concerts remembers.
So to move the story along, the war, thank God, finally ends, and Cohen returns back to Greece. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I mean, he has this life post return, and then later on does a concert tour, as you said, in 2009. And then we know then, of course, what happened to him. He just passed away just a couple of years ago, really.
That's right. I mean, Cohen died in 2016. I mean, I know exactly when he died. You can check my email and see when I sent that email and got the response with his.
You should have put a copy of that email in the book, Matti.
I considered talking about it, but I figured it was just one of those stories that are best, kept behind the scenes. Cohen has this incredible career after the war. So he announced that he was retiring, and he seemed to be finished in 1973. And I mean, I guess we should point out that would not have been weird. He was 39. So, most rock stars don't make it to 39. At the time, the cool thing to do if you were a serious rock musician was die at age 27. That's what happens to Hendrix, of course. That's what happens to Janis Joplin. That's what happens to Jim Morrison. And Cohen's over the hill, and he could have easily flared out in 73. And and yet he's rejuvenated by the war in some way. And again, he's so elusive, Cohen, and
Yeah.
so unwilling to engage in journalism that he never spells out exactly what happened. But we can say that before the war, he'd announced his retirement and said he was fed up with music. And immediately after the war, within a few months of the war, he's released one of his best albums, which is called New Skin for the Old Ceremony. And it includes Chelsea Hotel, pretty good song. It includes Lover, 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 which is another great song that he actually wrote at an Israeli Air Force base, and many other songs. But it also includes Who by Fire, which is a song that is directly inspired by the Yom Kippur liturgy and seems quite clearly connected to the fact that he'd just been through the Yom Kippur War. And something happens in the war, and then he's back on the horse, and he has this incredible career that lasts until he's in his early 80s. And you know, the latter half of his career after the war, the songs that we wouldn't have had he not gone back on stage after the war include Hallelujah, the little known niche hit Hallelujah, If It Be Your Will, Tower of Song, Dance Me to the End of Love. I mean, you can go on and on. There are probably 20 immortal songs, at least, that Cohen wrote after the war. So we should be grateful, I guess, that
Indeed.
Cohen traveled to the war and found his voice again.
And just to go back to his time in Israel, at one point in the book, you make this connection between him being a Kohen of the high priest order and using music almost as a blessing for the troops. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, Matti.
It was very interesting to me reading Cohen's manuscript to see how preoccupied he was with the fact that he was a Kohen. And Cohen in Hebrew means priest, but it's not a priest like a priest in Catholicism. In Judaism, there are no intermediaries between the congregation and God. So there's no priest in a synagogue. But there are Jews who have, I guess, a legacy of being descended from the priests in the Jerusalem temple 2,000 years ago. Now, the temple is destroyed by Rome, but the priestly caste continues to pass on the tradition of being a priest. So, and many of those people are named Cohen. So if you know someone named Cohen, they're almost certainly from the priestly caste.
Or may I interrupt you, or variations thereof, like Kaplan, Kagan, Kogan.
Yep, Katz. And there are a few variations on it. So Leonard Cohen was a Cohen. And that in modern times does not mean slaughtering animals in the temple. It means a few things, but mainly the role of the Cohen is to bless the congregation with this blessing, which is called the priestly blessing, Birkat HaKohanim. And it's just 15 words, and it summons divine protection and calls it down on the congregation. May God bless and protect you. May God turn his countenance toward you. And it's a beautiful and very ancient blessing that appears in the Torah. And Cohen, from a very young age, is told that he has this power. He has the power to protect people with words. And if we consider why someone would choose to be a poet, it's a pretty weird choice, for a kid, for any kid. And yet, if you're told from a young age that words have power and you have a particular power with words, then you can see how that might lead you into the world of poetry and song. And in the war, Cohen seems to have felt very strongly, although again, he won't tell us this explicitly, he feels that he can protect people with his words. And he's he's playing for audiences that are facing death. I mean, he knows that this concert might be the last thing these people hear, and he's aware of it, and they're aware of it, and he wants to do something for them. And he's not at a stage in his religious life where he can really say the priestly blessing. He's not going to get up in front of these people and say, may God bless and protect you. So instead, he riffs on it. And if you listen to the song Lover, 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 you can get on Spotify right now. Listen to the song at the very end of the song. There's a very strange verse. It says, may the spirit of this song, may it rise up pure and free. May it be a shield for you, a shield against the enemy. And this is a song written at an airbase in Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And it seems clear to me, although I'm guessing here, but I'm willing to take the leap, that Cohen is trying to be a Cohen in his own way. He's trying to protect these people. It's part of what's going on.
And while he wasn't religious in the sense of observance, did you get the sense, though, that he was religious in the sense of a feeling?
Cohen was a deeply religious person. And for him, cold observance and empty ritual were not the point of Judaism. The point was really prophecy. and the point was transcendence.
As you said,
And
that vertical relationship.
but
Yeah.
the vertical, we thought we were too horizontal, and we needed to get back to being vertical. And he found that in different ways. I mean, he found it in ways that might have been constructive or less constructive. And he says in that famous speech from '64, he's like, let's go find that vertical seizure. Let's do it with, if prayer isn't working, let's do it with sex. Let's do it with drugs. Let's do it with whips, whatever it takes to get the vertical. And he did it in a Zen Buddhist monastery, and he did it with a Hindu teacher in India, and he tried, and he did it with many chemical substances, both over and under the counter. And he did it with women, and he was just trying everything. And but at the core of Cohen is a Jew who believed in God very deeply and continues this dialogue with God, this argument with God throughout his life, and it never stops. So, I mean, I think Cohen is much more religious than many people who would define themselves as religious. He's a deeply religious character, and we can look at his last song, which comes out about 6 weeks before he died. It's a song called "You Want It Darker," and the whole song is him talking to God, and he's saying at the very end of his life, if you're the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you're the healer, I'm crippled and lame. He's talking to God. You win. That's what he's saying. And then he says in Hebrew, "Hineni." It's in the song. Hineni in Hebrew means "here I am." It's a word that the prophets say in the Bible when they're not running away, when they're, God's trying to speak to them and they're just going to hear what he has to say. And that's what Cohen is saying. He's not running away anymore. Hineni, here I am. So he's having a very honest and an emotional conversation with God throughout his life. So who am I to say that Cohen wasn't religious?
So when we talk about legacy, at one point in the book, you include an interview that Leonard Cohen did with a journalist, and you wrote that he had said, quote, "I came to raise their spirits and they raised mine." And so at the end of the day, I think, as you've said, that this was really an inspirational kind of event for him going to Israel. And then he was able to do so much and be so productive after that. And it was a life-changing experience for him. Can we talk about it being a life-changing experience for the state of Israel and how the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, changed the nation?
So Israel after that war is a different country. And, for example, the labor Zionist leadership that had been in control of the country since before it was founded is really discredited by the war. Golda Meir is the prime minister, and the government is still very much that kibbutz leadership, the founders of the country, and they mess up the war, and the Israeli public really turns on them. And a few years after the war, labor loses power for the first time, and Likud comes to power. This happens in 1977, but it's directly linked to the Yom Kippur War. Israeli music changes. So up until the Yom Kippur War, the music is still very much that kind of collective music, accordion, a lot of first-person plurals, a lot of we, and Zionism and agriculture. And some of the biggest hits on the radio were performed by army entertainment troops. So it was very much that Israel, which still lives on in some ways, it's more or less completely dead in Israel, but lives on to some extent in American Jewish summer camps. That Israel of the chalutzim, of the pioneers, that Israel is really killed by 73, and all kinds of different voices that had been in the basement come out of the basement. The voice of Jews who came to Israel from the Islamic world. They'd really been kind of kept on the margins, and they start asserting themselves more. The religious settlement movement really gets going after the Yom Kippur War, demands for immediate peace with the Arab world, peace now. That also happens after the Yom Kippur War. So you have a more fractious, a more pluralistic country, for better or worse, after that war. And the music also changes. So the music stops sounding like the military entertainment troops, and it starts sounding a lot like Leonard Cohen. You start having these singer-songwriters who are speaking honestly about themselves and about their souls, and it's no longer music in the service of state or of Zionism. It's much more personal. And it's not that people heard Leonard Cohen and then imitated him, but Cohen was there for the change. That the change is the war, and Cohen is there. And within a few years, there are artists who sound a lot like him, although very few are as good as him. There is one who I mentioned in the book named Mayor Ariel, who is as good as Cohen, and coincidentally was in the same place as Cohen during the Yom Kippur War, except he was a paratrooper, and they passed within a mile or two of each other. We don't know if they actually intersected. There's no evidence that they did, but I mention it in the book because they're really parallel. Mayor Ariel is the Israeli Leonard Cohen. So something big happens in Israeli culture at that time, and Leonard Cohen's here to see it happen.
And as you also point out in the book, some became actually very observant following the Yom Kippur War. Some of the entertainers, for example, the comedian Pupek, who became Rabbi Mordechai Arnon, right? Became a religious figure. So that was also an impact. I'm so super mindful of the clock, Matti. You've been so generous with the time. So as we wind down really our conversation right now, I'd be totally remiss if I didn't ask you if you've seen the film Golda, which is out right now, and just your general thoughts on it.
I haven't managed to see it yet. Unfortunately, I would love to, and I'm planning to see it. Just the idea of Helen Mirren playing Golda Meir is an amazing idea, and I'd like to see how they pulled it off. But unfortunately, I haven't got around to it yet. It's been a pretty crazy summer with kids at home, and the schedule has been a bit hard to manage. And I also must admit that I'm suffering from a Yom Kippur War overdose, so I have to make sure that I'm not overdoing it. But I'm definitely planning to check out the movie when I can.
And by the way, she worked on a kibbutz in the late 60s, I think in 67, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, around that time, I heard her interview. There's a great interview that she did with Yonit Levy on a podcast called Unholy, which is a podcast I recommend. But there's a great interview where she talks about her relationship with Israel. She talks about that time on the kibbutz. She talks about coming to Israel and going to the protests, the current wave of protests for democracy, and fascinating interview with a fascinating actress.
Right. All right. We're going to leave it right there. Once again, the book is Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen and the Sinai. Matti Friedman is the author. He's been our guest for this last hour. And I know that we're going to have you back, Matti. We want to thank you so much for joining us here on IsraelCast. We'll have you back before your next book comes out. And do you have a next book in the works?
Yeah, I have no choice. I have to, have to make money somehow. So I can't leave the book, can't leave the writing alone for too long. So yes, I do have a project on the way, but it's in the very early stages. So we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait a while before I have anything to say about it.
All right. Well, we'll have you back hopefully before the book comes out. But in the meantime, once again, thanks so much for joining us in this episode of IsraelCast. And we'll have info about Matti on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. Of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, why would you want to do that? Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. It's so easy. Simply search for IsraelCast. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps us with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more people around the world to find us and to hear from truly important and articulate people like Matti. You can also always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And it takes a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, JD Krebs, and Ellie Kodrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Mirtone Studios right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program, it's not by Leonard Cohen, but it is called My Eden by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas, do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz. Thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.